Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 14th of May of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first let's talk about Sumy direction. As we discussed in the previous update, the Ukrainians announced the evacuation of two towns, the village by the name of Varashba and the village by the name of Bilopolye. This is very important logistical hub. We see a very big network of the railways. One railway goes to Kiev, the second one goes to Russia in Kursk direction. So if the Russians establish control over this territory, then they will be able to establish some kind of connection with the mainland, with the Russian military forces, and this foothold they can use for further offensive operation. Furthermore, we got additional updates from the territory for probably the first geolocations, showing us that Ukrainians also redeploy their forces on this direction. For example, on this video we can see how the Ukrainians were trying to bring as close as possible to the line of combat contact Gepard air defense system, but as a result of Lancet strike, that Gepard air defense system was destroyed. Furthermore, we got a lot of updates from Sumy itself, and according to information we have, a lot of troopers began to disappear in the Sumy region, and currently it's very difficult to understand the reason why they're disappearing. Some sources are saying that this is the results of the work of Russian sabotage groups, but other sources are saying that currently the Ukrainian army consists of 80% of the soldiers who were mobilized recently and who has no willing to fight, and they find just the way how to surrender the Russians as soon as possible, and just 20% are highly or more or less motivated to fight with the Russians. So when talking about Sumy, of course, it's the secondary, it used to be the secondary direction for the Ukrainians, so that's why they're mainly where the forces who were recently mobilized and doesn't want to continue fighting to continue serving in Ukrainian army. The situation in Sumy is so critical that the Budanov, the head of the main Directorate of Intelligence of Amut of Ukraine, moved to Sumy with the purpose to stabilize the situation and to be in charge of defense of this direction. So basically he couldn't handle with the competition with the Syrsky officers in the direction, because he wanted to be responsible for the defense of Vovchansk, but most likely after he understood that he had no chances to do anything on the direction, he decided to move in Sumy and to be a single one on Sumy direction, to be responsible for the Sumy personally. Once again, according to information we have, very soon the Russians are going to open the second or the third or fifth front line of the direction and will try to attack the towns and villages on Sumy area. Now let's move to Kharkiv direction. First about Lyptsi direction. This is the western Kharkiv direction. We have a lot of very interesting details and updates from the territory. Let's start discussion. According to information we have, the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to establish complete control over the village by the name of Gluboka, this one. Yesterday, if you remember, we were talking about the flag that was established by the Russians above this building, which is, let's say, 100% confirmation of Russian control. And today we continue receiving different updates that the Russians moved further to the west, and that during the day there were very heavy clashes inside of Lyptsi itself. So this is like Lyptsi residential area. There were very heavy clashes, and by the beginning of making the video, the Russians managed to improve their positions and to capture significant number of buildings and streets on the direction, and to move closer to Lyptsi itself. So significant progress, as you can see. Furthermore, the sources reported that the Russians captured the fields between Gluboka and Lukyanska, the fields and this big forest, this one. Furthermore, right before I start making the video, a more or less reliable Russian source reported that the Russians captured the hill 212, so the highest point on this direction. And the sources reported if the Russians control this highest point, this is the highest point, this is the area, then the Russians can establish complete fire control or 100% fire control over everything that located, let's say, between the Russian positions and this white line. So basically, the Russian sources reported that the Russians established complete fire control over the main road that goes from Kharkiv to Lyptsi, and now the Ukrainians are no longer available to redeploy their forces without losses from the north to the south. Of course, significant progress of the Russian armed forces. We just need some geolocations to confirm this information and to call color the territory. Now let's move further in direction of Lyptsi. Today we got few geolocations from the territory. The Russian presence in the village was confirmed by the Ukrainian video. Then on the Ukrainian video we might see how the Ukrainian drones were FPV droning the Russians. When talking about deep state mappers, they confirm also the Russian complete control over the village, but for now we still haven't received any geolocations confirming the Russian progress, let's say, among the fields, this territory. Furthermore, if you remember, lots of mappers, lots of resources have already adjusted their maps, showing the village by the name of Zelene and the villages around this and fields around the village under complete Russian control. But today we got the video of how the Russians were bombing this tree line, this defense belt, and this video confirms that most likely there are still Ukrainians and there are still Ukrainian, let's say, soldiers, and the Russians are in the process of establishing control over the territory. Anyway, when talking about this Lyptsi direction, the Russians have completed their first wave goal for around 90%. The only thing they need to do is to get inside of Lyptsi and to capture this village. Of course, this is not the question of 1, 2 or 3 days. It's obviously 2 weeks required for the Russians to reach this white line, but as soon as they do this, then the Russians most likely will introduce the second wave of attack, the second wave of reinforcements, whose main purpose would be to move further to the south in direction of Cherkaske, Tishki and Tsirkuny. Now let's move to the central, let's say, area between western and the eastern one. Let's talk about the village by the name of Ternova. Today, some sources reported that the Russians entered the village and established complete control over the territory, but yet we haven't received any, let's say, confirmations whether the Russians managed to do this or not. So for now, we are keeping this area as is. Now let's move to the eastern flank of Kharkiv directions, to the villages from Staritsa to Vovchansk. Significant number of updates and reports were received. According to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, the Russians established complete control over the village by the name of Burguvatka. Furthermore, we have 2 geolocations confirming this. On this video, we can see the Russian soldiers who were moving among the buildings along the street in Burguvatka itself. On this video, we can see the, let's say, advanced Russian troopers who was moving along the Burguvatka Zarechna street, and the Russian soldiers were attacked by the Ukrainian mortar systems. Both videos confirm significant Russian progress, and the most important, the Russians managed to reach Seversky Donetsk river, this one. This river, at least the Russian bank, the right bank of the river, is already under Russian control. Yet we haven't received any updates whether the Russians managed to establish complete control over Staritsa, but this is not so important for the Russians because they captured Burguvatka, but also to improve their positions, to secure the flanks. Most likely during the next day, the Russians will be completely focused on capturing this village and taking under control this territory, because if the Russians are able to do this, this will lead to significant results, and of course the Russians the most important will be able to say secure the flank, and then they will be able to move further, let's say, to the south and further to the west in direction of Seversky Donetsk river as well. Seversky Donetsk is very important in this battle, and we will discuss the importance of this river in 5 minutes. Now let's move to Vovchansk as well. As you can see, we have adjusted the map. We have colored most of the northern part in the gray zone. According to some mappers, the Russians control around 90% of the stronghold of the northern part of Vovchansk, not of entire, but that Vovchansk that located to the north of the Vovcha river. This blue line is Vovcha river. We have additional geolocations. We have additional videos and photos of more and more waves of Russian troopers heading to the city. We have the videos on some different mappers, reliable sources reported that the Russians established control over the kindergarten and over the college in this area. We have the videos of, let's say, bombardments of the central part. So the Russians are advancing, and the Russians are forcing the Ukrainians to fall back from the northern part and to leave this part of Vovchansk. Furthermore, the Russians attack Vovchansk from the eastern part. Today we got geolocation that was published by the Ukrainians, how the Ukrainian FPV drones were bombing the Russian infantry in this area. This video is an enough to color the territory and to confirm the Russian presence there. So as you can see, the northern part of Vovchansk was cut off from the mainland. There are still a lot of bridges. Some of them were destroyed. Some of them are under complete Russian FPV drone control. There probably this bridge still exists, and there are lots of small bridges just for infantry, just for redeployment of soldiers, which of course the Ukrainians would use as soon as time comes. But even from this perspective, we can see that currently the Russians are moving from the industrial zone on the north to the Vovchansk, to the Vovchi river to the south. So this is like the main Russian attack, the main Russian road of attack. And if the Russians are able to do this, if they're able to force the Ukrainians to fall back, now very likely that Ukrainians from the eastern part, from the northeastern part, would be encircled or would be forced to fall back on the southern part of the river as well. So once again, if summarize everything, and according to Ukrainian sources, according to the governor, the mayor of Vovchansk, most likely by the end of this week, the Russians will be able to establish complete control over the northern part. And then we got the most important question, what the Russians are going to do next. Because to continue moving further, the Russians need to cross the river, to cross Vovchi river or Seversky Donetsk river. And the question is where the Russians are going to do this and how the Russians are going to do this. And this is the reason, and this is the main goal why the Russians started their offensive on this direction as well, and why the Russians were so fast in advancing towards Vovcha and Seversky Donetsk river, because as we discussed in the previous updates, most of the pontoon bridges, most of the supply roads were located here between the forests, where it was very difficult to hide, let's say, from the Russian fire, from the Russian strikes and Russian intelligence drones. And now the Russians control the Russian bank, which confirms that the Russians also control the bridges and roads that used to be under Ukraine control. And if you ask my opinion, I suppose that the Russians have already launched, let's say, the landing operation, and most likely the Russians have already landed their infantry in this part of the foot called in this side of Vovchansk, because this is the best area for landing operation, and this is the best area for concentration of forces before further offensive operation from the Russian side towards the western flank of Vovchansk itself. So as I understand, this is exactly what happens. Furthermore, there is a forest, as you can see. It's not very easy for the Ukrainians to discover the Russian concentration of forces. I don't think that there are Ukrainians in this part, or at least some not so many troopers, because it's too far from the mainland and it's too difficult to control such a big square kilometers from the Ukrainian side. But once again, I suppose that now the Russians are doing something like this. Currently, we haven't received any reports about this, but as soon as we receive this information, these confirmations, of course, this is going to be a significant result from the Russian side. Furthermore, a few additional updates from Kharkiv direction. When talking about counter-artillery duels, probably the most area with the most concentrated area with Lancet currently is Vovchansk and Kharkiv direction. Significant number of Lancet strikes, significant number of artillery systems were destroyed during the previous 24 hours, during the previous days since the beginning of the Kharkiv offensive operation. The Russians destroyed a multiple launch rocket system, just the regular howitzers, self-propelled howitzers, and of course most of them were Western production. The Russians suppressed the artillery system for Armed Forces Ukraine. Of course, this gave them significant benefits in further offensive to the south. So this is the situation in Kharkiv direction. The Russians continue advancing. The Russians are about to collapse, to defeat the Ukrainians in Lyptsi and to defeat them in Vovchansk. And once again, as soon as the Russians bypass the first defense belt, most likely they will introduce the second wave of troopers, and they will start the second wave of offensive operation. Now let's move to let's say old line of combat contact. Let's talk about northern Kupiansk direction. The Russians continue improving their positions in front of Stelmakhovka. Currently, the main Russian goal is to capture the tree line along, let's say, entire Stelmakhovka. Some part of the tree line is already under Russian control. We're talking about this part, but as I understand, the Russians are planning to move further to the north and to take under control this entire line. And as soon as the Russians establish control over this entire line, south and the north, and then the Russians would start offensive to Stelmakhovka itself. Now, as you can see, they have finished just 30% of the required things, but this is an ongoing process and the Russians are moving. Now let's move to the south in Kupiansk direction. We have additional updates from Zherebets River. As we can see, we have lots of geolocations of Ukrainian strikes, of Ukrainian attacks on the Russian positions. This video confirms this. All these icons confirms that the Russians concentrated additional forces on this direction, not just the tanks, also not just artillery systems, also tanks, personnel carriers, armored vehicles. The Russians are moving everything to Novovodiane, and most likely the Russians are going to start offensive operation in direction of Makeivka also in the very near future. Now let's move to Siversk direction. For now, no changes on the ground. The Russians continue attacking the Ukrainian forces to the south of Bilogorovka. They're trying to break through this defense belt, this forest. Significant number of total flamethrower strikes on Ukrainian positions. For now, without any reasons, without any progress on the ground, but most likely during the next few days, the Russians will make more attempts to break through the Ukrainian defense on this direction. Now let's move to Chasiv Yar. We have significant number of updates and reports from this territory. Probably the most important things are coming from this area. Today we got a lot of geolocations from, let's say, Chasiv Yar itself. For example, the Ukrainian sources published the video, at least according to the author of this video. We can see the Ukrainian drone who was FPV droning the Russian advanced forces in the vicinity on the edge of Kalinovka. Currently, it's very difficult to understand how exactly the Russians reached this area, but the Ukrainian drone was attacking the Russians here. So this video confirms that the most advanced Russian forces managed to enter Lisova Street. For now, we're not changing the map because maybe those were something like sabotage or reconnaissance group. Some mappers have adjusted their maps, showing that the Russians managed to reach Kalinova by past these farms and by taking control these farms as well. So for now, we don't have enough information to make any adjustments how exactly the Russians entered there, but this is very interesting information, because if the Russians entered Kalinova, then we can start counting days when the Russians are able to get Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal from the northern part of Chasiv Yar, and after that the Russians will be able to start the greatest battle for this stronghold as well. Now let's move to eastern Chasiv Yar. As we discussed in the previous update, the Russians published the video how their turtle tank was entering the eastern part. As you can see, the eastern part of Chasiv Yar was already reduced to ruins under the Russian fire, and we see no resistance from the Ukrainian side. Nothing was attacking the Russian tank, and the Russian tank entered there without any resistance from the Ukrainian side. So the Russian tank was moving like this, and the Russian tank entered here. We don't know for sure whether the Russians established control over the first high-rise building or not. The only thing we have is that the Russians entered the eastern Chasiv Yar, probably the second time in a row. Now we are moving further to the south in direction of Klishchiivka. We got very interesting updates from the territory. As you can see, we have improved and increased the gray zone. Today, the sources published, the Russian sources, the Russian motorized division published the video of the fire on the church in the south and the central part of Klishchiivka. And the Russians were saying that on this video we can see the Ukrainians who were bombing the Russian soldiers who tried to hide in the church. And it's not enough of evidence just to show the church that was set on fire, but anyway, we adjusted the map, increasing the gray zone. But if this report is correct, and if the information we saw on that video is true, then that means the Russians established complete control over more than 50%, more than 60% of Klishchiivka, and that Ukrainians were forced to fall back towards the let's say landfill, towards the hills that located on the western part. So here, so basically the Ukrainians let's say entered the final defense belt before complete collapse of Klishchiivka fortification area. If the Russians are able to force the Ukrainians to fall back from these hills, then the Ukrainians will be forced to fall back very far to the west, right behind the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. So very interesting details about Klishchiivka. We're going to follow this situation, and we're waiting for more updates to confirm or not to confirm this information. Now we're moving further to Avdiivka area. We stopped receiving any updates about very heavy clashes or advances on the ground. Probably there are very heavy clashes. Probably the Russians are advancing. Probably the Russians are pushing and taking new territories under their control. Because when talking about the Ministry of Defense report, the Ukrainians still have the heaviest losses exactly on Avdiivka and the Donetsk directions. The Russians continue bombing the Ukrainian forces with different types of weapon, but we stop receiving any updates about further Russian progress. Very difficult to understand what kind of plans the Russians currently have on this position, on this direction. Maybe they are going to get some rest for a few weeks and then they will restart their offensive. Maybe the Russians are concentrating their forces, or maybe the Russians are just trying to understand what exactly the Ukrainians are planning to do with the Kharkiv offensive. Krasnogorovka, the same situation. No changes, no updates during the previous 24 hours. Very interesting updates we continue receiving from Paraskoviivka. The 79th Brigade continue blaming their commanders about the critical situation on the direction and in their brigade itself. The sources reported that they confirmed that some parts of their brigade would be redeployed to Kharkiv direction, and they're saying that there is still no support, no supply, no food, no ammo, nothing, and the Russians started another offensive operation on this direction, and the Ukrainians are saying that very high chances that they would be forced to fall back from Paraskoviivka and that Paraskoviivka would be captured by the Russians during the next upcoming night. Now let's move to South Donetsk direction to Urozhaina and Staromayorska. The Russians improved their positions to the west of Staromayorska. The Russians continue bombing the Ukrainian forces in the southern part of Urozhaina. At least this video confirms that Ukrainians still control the farms. The southern part, at least 60, 70, 80% of the farms still remains under Ukrainian control. The Russians, after a few successful operations, were forced to fall back under the Ukrainian pressure. So the situation remains without any changes for another day in a row. So let's wait more, because the Russians made this most important. As a result of their offensive, they forced the Ukrainians to redeploy additional forces to the south, and now the Russians are bombing and attacking the Ukrainians, fresh Ukrainian forces who, let's say, took their positions in the southern part of the village. We haven't received anything from Rabotina area, and the same story about Kherson, just some activity of the Russian forces in Kyzyomys. The Russians continue bombing and attacking the possible concentration of Ukrainian forces, but after the Russians launched Kharkiv offensive, we see complete, let's say, reduction of any activity from the Ukrainian side on the direction. They stopped any attempts to cross the river or something like this, because, as I understand, the main forces, most of the forces were redeployed to Kharkiv area. Very interesting political events we received during the previous 24 hours, and the most important is that Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, arrived in Kiev today. He had a very tough and very difficult conversation with Zelensky. Most likely Blinken was asking Zelensky what is happening in Sumy and Kharkiv area, and where is the money we sent you for building the fortifications, because according to their calculations and their budgets, they sent more than $1 billion to Ukraine, to Zelensky, to build fortifications, and now they see that the Russians managed to bypass those fortifications without any problems and any difficulties. Furthermore, as I understand, Blinken arrived in Kiev not just to have a very difficult talk with Zelensky, also he brought some news. If you remember, a few weeks ago, Blinken arrived, were moving to visit Xi Jinping in China, and they were talking with him about the further support and supply of let's say, Russia to stop. Blinken was trying to force China to stop supporting Russia, and now, as I understand, he arrived in Kiev to give some details about that conversation, because according to information we have, Putin is going to visit China tomorrow on the 15th and 16th of May, so most likely Blinken arrived to Kiev to give some details about possible conversation, upcoming conversation between Putin and between Xi Jinping. Furthermore, according to information we have, Putin is going to China with the already former Minister of Defense Shoigu and new Minister of Defense of Russian Federation Belousov, probably to introduce the new Minister of Defense to the leader of China. So as you can see, a lot of underground conversations, lots of rumors, lots of attempts to speculate on this topic. But anyway, it is very interesting. Regarding the very difficult situation in Ukraine and the very difficult conversation possible between Blinken and Zelensky. Anyway, the Western countries continue to support Kiev. Spain is going to send additional tanks. Denmark is going to send F-16s, but today they rescheduled the deadline of the sending of the F-16s. United States of America is going to send weapon, but anyway, nobody for 100% sure that this is going to save Ukraine from complete collapse, because according to information we have, the armed forces of Ukraine have no reserves left. At least this information was provided by the Budanov, the chief of Ukrainian intelligence, during the interview with the New York Times. And of course, this is not that the Western countries and Zelensky himself wanted to hear from his puppet, let's call it like this. But as we understand, Budanov currently start playing his own game. Nobody knows for sure what kind of purposes and what kind of goals he has, but something big, as this is a very big conflict between Zelensky, Budanov and Syrskyi is going to happen very soon, as I understand. And the reason of this conflict, of course, is going to be complete collapse and defeat of Ukrainians on Kharkiv direction. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminder: you condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.